Snow gathers silently around the old wooden cabin as a gray-muzzled German shepherd lies at its center, breathing slow and steady. Outside, across the frozen valley, smoke pours thick and black from neighboring homes where fires roar, but warmth never stays. They laughed at the veteran when he arrived with nothing but an aging truck, a loyal dog, and an idea that made no sense, a cabin built inside another cabin, walls separated by nothing but air. Now, on the third night of an early winter, the wind howls like something alive and the temperature keeps falling. The town burns through its firewood. Furniture is dragged to the hearth. Dogs whimper. People pray. Inside the strange, double-walled cabin, the veteran and his dog sit quietly. Sleeves rolled, the fire low, the air still. If stories of quiet faith, loyalty, and forgotten wisdom speak to you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe miracles don't always arrive loudly but still save lives, consider subscribing. This winter's story has only just begun. Snow fell without wind, thick and deliberate, settling into the pine forest of northern Wyoming as daylight faded early behind the mountains. The cold arrived quietly, the kind that did not announce itself with storms, but with absence of sound, of warmth, of mercy. Eamon Calder arrived just before dusk, guiding his dented forest green pickup along a rutted logging road that had not seen fresh gravel in years. He was 58, broad-shouldered, even after age had begun to pull him inward, his frame thick with old strength rather than youth. His beard, once dark, had gone iron gray and grew unevenly now, as if he trimmed it out of habit rather than care. Deep lines ran from his nose to the corners of his mouth, etched there by decades of squinting into sun-snow and places where the horizon offered no comfort. His eyes were pale and watchful, the color of winter sky just before a storm, eyes that measured distance and threat without conscious thought. People used to say he looked intimidating. Eamon had never corrected them. It kept conversations short. In the passenger seat sat Rook. The German shepherd was 7 years old, large even for his breed, with a dense black and sable coat that grew heavier each winter. His muzzle had begun to gray at the edges, not from age alone, but from long exposure to cold climates and hard nights. One ear stood fully upright. The other bore a slight bend at the tip, a remnant of an old injury Eamon never spoke about and no one ever asked. Rook's eyes were dark amber, alert, and unsettlingly intelligent eyes that did not look at the world but through it. He lay still as the truck crept forward, muscles coiled beneath his fur nose, twitching faintly as if reading the air. They did not speak. They never did. Eamon cut the engine when the cabin finally came into view. It sat in a shallow clearing at the edge of the forest, a single-room log structure built decades earlier by someone whose priorities had been speed and shelter, not endurance. The logs were rough-cut pine notched crudely at the corners, their seams stuffed with old moss and brittle clay. Snow had already begun to collect in the gaps. A thin column of smoke did not rise from the chimney because there was no fire yet, and because the place had not been lived in for years. Rook exited the truck before Eamon could open his own door, landing silently in the snow and circling the cabin once, nose low, tail stiff. He stopped near the north wall, hackles lifting slightly, and released a low, almost inaudible growl. Eamon watched him. He trusted that sound more than he trusted memory. Inside the cabin smelled of old wood dust and cold that had settled into the grain itself. The floorboards creaked beneath Eamon's boots, warped by years of seasonal swelling and contraction. He set down his tools, hand saws, chisels, a draw knife wrapped in oilcloth, then stacked the few supplies he had brought: canned beans, dried rice, salt pork, coffee. It was not much. He had not come here to live comfortably. Comfort had never kept anyone alive. That first night the temperature dropped faster than Eamon expected. The fire he built was hot enough, but the heat did not stay. It slipped away through the walls, pulled upward by invisible currents that whispered through every seam. By midnight, frost crept along the interior corners like pale veins. Rook refused to lie down. He paced from wall to wall, stopping where the wind pushed hardest, ears snapping toward sounds Eamon barely heard. When a stronger gust struck, the dog growled again, deeper this time, then sat squarely in the center of the room, eyes fixed on Eamon. Eamon understood. He had learned long ago that wind killed before bullets did. In the mountains overseas, he had felt its steel heat from bodies that still breathed, turning fatigue into hypothermia, slowing hands, dulling judgment. He had watched men die wrapped in gear worth thousands because the cold had found a way in. Fire alone had never been enough then either. The memory came uninvited, as it always did. A night patrol, snow falling sideways, radios silent. A man younger than Rook, now shaking uncontrollably, eyes glassy, insisting he was fine. Eamon had held him, felt the shivering stop, and known too late that the fight was already lost. He fed another log into the fire and watched the flames flare uselessly bright. By morning, Eamon's breath fogged the air inside the cabin. Rook stood with his front paws braced against the door, watching the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. Outside, snow had risen to mid-calf, muffling the forest into a stillness so complete it felt artificial. Later that day, as Eamon unloaded the last of his gear, a woman appeared at the edge of the clearing. Her name, he would learn, was Maribel Haynes. She was in her early 40s, tall and narrow-hipped, wrapped in a wool coat, too thin for the weather. Her dark hair was pulled into a practical knot at the nape of her neck, streaked prematurely with silver. Her face bore the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to living alone, sharp cheekbones, weathered skin, eyes that assessed before they sympathized. She lived 3 miles down the valley, one of the few year-round residents who had not yet been chased away by winter. "I heard a truck," she said, keeping her distance. "Didn't think anyone was foolish enough to come up here this late in the season." Eamon nodded once. That was all. Her gaze flicked to Rook, who stood between them without aggression, simply present. "That dog yours?" "He is," Eamon replied. His voice was low, roughened by years of disuse. Maribel studied the cabin, the thin smoke, the snow creeping through the seams. "You'll burn through twice the wood most folks do," she said, "and still freeze by February." Eamon did not argue. He had not come to convince anyone. That night the temperature fell again, sharper this time, dropping hard after sunset. Rook growled when the wind shifted his body, aligning instinctively with the coldest currents. Eamon lay awake on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the cabin breathe and leak and fail around him. He was not searching for peace. Peace had never lasted. He was searching for control over cold, over loss, over the one enemy that had followed him home from every war and waited patiently for him to grow old enough to lose. Near dawn, he sat up, pulled on his boots, and began measuring the interior walls with a length of knotted cord. Rook watched him without confusion, as if this too had always been inevitable. Eamon Calder did not believe in miracles. He believed in physics, in mistakes paid for with blood, and in the loyalty of a dog that knew when a place was unsafe before any human did. By the time the sun rose pale and distant over the trees, Eamon had made his decision. This cabin would not be enough, so he would build another one inside it. Eamon Calder began tearing the cabin apart from the inside on the third morning after the temperature first dropped below zero. He did not start with the roof or the outer walls as any sensible man would. He pulled up floorboards, stacked them neatly against the south wall, and exposed the uneven stone foundation beneath. Each plank came free with a groan, as if the cabin itself resisted being unmade. Rook followed every movement in silence, his claws clicking softly on the remaining boards, head-tilted eyes tracking Eamon's hands rather than the tools. The dog understood change when it came with purpose. The work was slow, deliberate, and unsettling to anyone who might have been watching. Eamon measured the interior with knotted cord marking distances on the logs with charcoal calculating margins that made no practical sense to the untrained eye. He was not fixing weakness. He was creating absent space where nothing would move. The inner structure took shape first in his mind, not as walls, but as boundaries, where heat would stop, where wind would die. By the end of the week, word spread down the valley. It was Maribel Haynes who brought the first visitor, not because she approved, but because curiosity had outweighed her caution. She arrived late in the afternoon with a man Eamon did not know, both of them moving carefully through the snow-crusted clearing. Maribel looked the same as before, tall, angular, her dark hair streaked with silver, pulled back tight eyes, sharp and unsentimental. The man beside her was younger, mid-30s at most, broad through the chest, but narrow at the hips with a heavy brown beard that made his face look older than it was. His name was Owen Pike, a seasonal logger who stayed through winters he couldn't afford to escape. His nose was permanently red from cold exposure, and his hands were thick with scar tissue fingers, bent slightly inward, as if they never fully relaxed. "You should see this," Maribel said to him, stopping short of the door. "He's cutting the house in half." Eamon did not look up when they entered. He was kneeling near the center of the cabin, fitting a newly cut beam into place, his movements economical, precise. Sweat darkened the collar of his flannel despite the cold. His beard was rimed with frost where his breath condensed and froze. Owen stared openly. "You planning to tear it down from the inside?" he asked, tone caught between amusement and disbelief. "That's one way to save on hauling debris." Eamon slid the beam into position, tested it with both hands, then stood. He was taller than Owen by several inches, thicker through the shoulders, his posture rigid in a way that suggested habit rather than pride. "I'm building another cabin," he said. "Inside this one." Owen laughed once, a short bark of sound that died quickly when Rook rose from his place near the north wall. The dog did not bare his teeth. He simply stood weight forward, eyes fixed on Owen's chest. Maribel exhaled through her nose. "I told you," she said. "He's serious." The laughter did not stop after that. It multiplied. By the following week, 2 more men came by under the pretense of offering help. One was Caleb Morn, a retired cattle hauler with a limp and a voice permanently hoarse from years of shouting over engines. He was tall and raw-boned, his face creased deeply, eyes pale and restless. The other was Elias Reed, thin as a fence post with blonde hair that never quite lay flat, and a nervous habit of rubbing his palms together when he spoke. Neither stayed long. "Wood against wood," Caleb said, shaking his head. "You'll freeze faster. Fire needs air." Eamon did not correct him. He did not explain that fire needed oxygen, not wind, that uncontrolled air movement was theft, not fuel. He continued working while they talked, his answers limited to nods or silence. When they left, Elias laughed openly, the sound carrying back toward the valley. "Man's building a coffin with a door," he said. Rook tracked their departure from the doorway ears high, then returned to lie exactly where the draft cut across the floor. He did this every night, repositioning himself as the temperature dropped, choosing the coldest place without hesitation. Eamon watched and learned. He adjusted his chalk marks accordingly. The inner framework began to rise rough beams, set a careful distance from the outer walls. Eamon stripped bark from every log, working until his hands bled, then wrapping them and continuing. Bark trapped moisture. Moisture turned to ice. Ice expanded. Expansion made gaps. Gaps invited wind. Wind killed. These were not theories to him. They were facts written into bodies he could not forget. Late one evening, when the sky pressed low and purple with incoming snow, another figure appeared at the clearing's edge. This one did not call out. She stood watching for several minutes before Rook noticed her, his head lifted, ears rotating, body going still. A soft, warning growl vibrated in his chest, barely audible. Eamon straightened slowly and turned. The woman was older than Maribel, perhaps in her late 50s, with a compact, sturdy build shaped by years of hard labor. Her hair was white blonde, cut short and uneven, as if she had done it herself with dull shears. Her skin was weathered and darkened by sun, and wind creased deeply around her eyes and mouth. She wore a heavy wool coat patched at the elbows, and carried herself with a slight forward lean, as though braced against something unseen. Her name, she said, was Ruth Kessler. "I lost my husband to a winter like this," she said without introduction. Her voice was low, steady, stripped of drama. "He went to bed warm, didn't wake up." Eamon did not speak. He did not need to. Ruth stepped closer, studying the beams, the empty space taking shape inside the cabin. "People think cold is loud," she continued. "Storms, wind, but it's quiet when it kills you." Her eyes flicked to Rook, who had settled again in the center of the room. "That dog knows." "Yes," Eamon said. It was the longest word he had spoken all day. Ruth nodded once. "They'll laugh until they're scared," she said. "Then they'll stop." She left before the snow began to fall. That night the temperature plunged harder than before. Wind came down off the ridge in sharp bursts, probing the cabin like fingers testing a lock. The fire burned bright, but Eamon noticed something new. Where the inner beam stood, the air felt different, still, heavy. The flame wavered less there, steadier, as if sheltered by something invisible. Rook slept for the first time near the unfinished inner wall, his body stretched out, breathing slow and even. Eamon sat awake long past midnight, listening not to the wind, but to the absence of it. By morning, fresh snow covered the clearing, erasing footprints, muffling sound. The valley looked clean, untouched, deceptively calm. Eamon resumed his work without pause. He did not think about the laughter anymore. He thought about margins, about thresholds, about how much space was enough to stop movement without trapping death. From the road below the cabin looked wrong now. Too thick, too quiet. Smoke rose thinner than it should have for the amount of wood burned. People noticed. They talked. And though they did not yet understand what Eamon Calder was building, something in them began to shift from ridicule to unease. Because winter was only beginning, and the cold had not yet asked its hardest questions. Winter arrived without ceremony, slipping down from the high ridges in the late afternoon and tightening its grip the moment the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Snow fell steadily, layer upon layer, beginning before dusk and continuing until the pale blue of dawn returned, leaving the forest hushed and burdened beneath its weight. Each night the temperature dropped sharply, as if something unseen was testing the land, waiting to see what would fail first. Inside the cabin, Eamon Calder lived between two worlds of wood. The outer walls took the punishment without complaint. Wind struck them head-on, rattling the older logs and forcing its way into every weakness left by the men who had built the structure decades earlier. Ice formed along the exterior seams, expanding and contracting with each passing hour. Snow packed itself against the north face, climbing steadily, sealing the cabin from the outside in a slow, suffocating embrace. The inner structure was different. Eamon had sealed it with obsessive care, packing clay mixed with coarse fibers and pine resin into every gap until the surface felt continuous beneath his fingers. The walls did not sing when the wind rose. They did not breathe. Inside that smaller space, the air remained heavy and unmoving, as if the cabin had learned how to hold its breath. Rook sensed the change before Eamon trusted it. The German shepherd stopped circling at night. He no longer pressed his body against the coldest drafts or shifted restlessly as the temperature fell. Instead, he lay stretched out in the center of the floor, well away from the iron stove, his thick chest rising and falling in slow, even rhythm. His ears still twitched when gusts struck the outer walls, but his body did not tense. He slept. That alone unsettled Eamon. For years he had learned not to trust comfort. Comfort bred carelessness. Carelessness killed. Yet here it was arriving uninvited, settling into his bones like warmth that did not ask permission. The fire burned smaller now. Eamon fed it cautiously, watching how the heat behaved, how long it lingered. Where once the warmth fled upward and outward, stolen by invisible currents, it now stayed close, filling the inner space evenly. The stove no longer roared. It murmured. Late one night, when the snow fell so thick it erased the boundary between ground and sky, Eamon woke suddenly, heart pounding, the old reflex dragging him from sleep. For a moment he did not know where he was. The silence pressed in around him, unfamiliar and complete. Then he heard Rook's breathing, steady, calm. Eamon sat up, his joints stiff, and waited for the cold to bite. It did not. The air inside the inner cabin was cool but gentle, a controlled chill rather than the sharp, invasive cold he expected. He pressed his bare palm against the inner wall. The wood felt neutral, not warm, not cold. Balanced. Outside, the wind howled. He did not sleep again that night, but not from fear. He lay awake thinking, tracing patterns in his mind, revisiting old lessons he had learned too late in other places. Heat did not disappear, he reminded himself. It was taken, and what could not move could not steal. By the third week of sustained cold, the valley began to change. Smoke rose thicker from neighboring cabins, darker, heavier, the plumes hanging low beneath the cloud cover. Eamon noticed it while splitting wood one morning, the axe ringing dully as it struck frozen grain. His own woodpile had shrunk, but slowly, predictably. Others were burning through theirs at an alarming pace. Ruth Kessler came by again, this time without warning. She appeared just after midday, walking carefully through knee-deep snow, her patched wool coat dusted white, her short pale hair flattened by frost. Her face was as weathered as before, but there was a new tightness around her mouth, a tension that had not been there on her previous visit. "I wanted to see it," she said simply, stamping snow from her boots near the door. Eamon stepped aside to let her in. Ruth paused the moment she crossed into the inner space. Her shoulders dropped slightly, an unconscious release of tension. She stood still, breathing, in eyes scanning the walls, the low, steady fire, Rook sleeping in the open floor. "It's quieter," she said. "Not just sound. Everything." "Yes," Eamon replied. She moved closer to the inner wall, pressing her palm flat against the wood. "My place screams when the wind hits," she said. "Like it's alive and panicking." She pulled her hand back slowly. "This one feels stubborn." Rook opened one eye, regarded her briefly, then closed it again. That night, something else happened. A sharp, frantic barking echoed through the trees shortly after sunset, high-pitched, irregular, the sound of panic rather than aggression. Rook was on his feet, instantly, body rigid, ears locked toward the forest. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a human voice shouting, barely audible through the wind. Eamon grabbed his coat and rifle and stepped outside. Near the edge of the clearing, a man struggled through the snow, dragging something behind him. He was tall but thin, his frame gaunt beneath layers of mismatched clothing. His beard was untrimmed and brittle with ice, his face hollowed by exhaustion. He was pulling a dog, a young mixed breed, perhaps a year old, with short tan fur, matted dark with blood along one hind leg. The man's name was Jonah Hale. He had come from the lower valley, he said between gasping breaths after his stove cracked during the night. He was a trapper, solitary by nature, with a narrow face and eyes that darted constantly, as if he expected the world to turn on him at any moment. The injury to his dog had happened 2 days earlier, a steel trap misfiring under snow. Jonah had tried to wait out the storm. He had failed. Inside the inner cabin, the young dog collapsed almost immediately, sides heaving. Rook approached slowly, head low, tail neutral, and sniffed the injured leg with clinical interest. There was no hostility, only assessment. He lay down beside the stranger's dog, his body radiating calm. Jonah noticed. His shoulders shook once before he could stop himself. "I didn't think anyone would answer," he said hoarsely. "I saw your smoke. It was thin. Thought maybe you were gone." Eamon cleaned and bound the wound while the fire burned steadily behind him. The heat did not waver, did not flee when the door opened and closed. Jonah stared at the walls, at the space, at the way the warmth did not collapse when the wind screamed outside. "How much wood you burning?" Jonah asked. Eamon glanced at the small stack beside the stove. "Enough." Jonah stayed until morning. By dawn, the snow had stopped leaving the world frozen in place. Jonah stepped outside, looking back once at the thickened structure, the layered walls, the way the inner cabin sat protected within the outer shell like a secret. He nodded, gratitude etched deep into his tired face, and disappeared back into the trees with his dog limping beside him. Word traveled faster after that. Not admiration. Not yet. Something closer to confusion. Caleb Morn rode past on horseback one afternoon, his limp exaggerated by the cold. He did not stop, but he slowed long enough to study the cabin, his pale eyes narrowed. Elias Reed passed later, hauling a sled piled with firewood, his shoulders hunched, his usual nervous grin absent. Eamon watched them from inside unseen. That night the temperature dropped further than it had all season. Frost climbed the outer walls in thick white sheets. Snow sealed the lower gaps completely. The wind battered the cabin relentlessly, searching for purchase. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. Rook slept through it all, his back to the stove paws, twitching occasionally in dreams Eamon could not see. Eamon lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling beams, listening not to the storm, but to the silence it could not penetrate. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to consider something dangerous. That this might be enough. That loyalty, patience, and a refusal to accept the old answers might hold against the worst winter had to offer. Outside, the snow kept falling, indifferent and absolute. Inside, between 2 walls of wood and a layer of unmoving air, a man and a dog endured. The blizzard announced itself long before it arrived. The sky over northern Wyoming turned the color of old steel, heavy and low, pressing down on the valley, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. By mid-afternoon, the wind began to rise not in gusts, but in a steady, deliberate force that scoured the ridgelines and pushed snow sideways through the trees. When night fell, it did so abruptly, swallowing the last weak light and leaving only motion and sound. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm did not relent. Snow piled against cabins until windows disappeared and doors vanished beneath drifts. Ordinary log houses became furnaces that could not keep their heat, their occupants feeding fires without pause, watching wood supplies vanish by the hour. Smoke poured thick and black from chimneys hanging low and choking in the still air between wind surges. Some families began tearing apart furniture, chairs, shelves, even bed frames, splitting them into jagged fuel. Others wrapped themselves in every blanket they owned and waited, listening to walls creak and pop under the strain of cold. At Eamon Calder's place, the outer cabin took the beating in silence. Snow climbed halfway up its walls, sealing cracks and weighing down the roof. Wind slammed against the logs, probing, clawing, searching for weakness. Inside the outer shell, the air was cold but strangely calm, sheltered from the violence outside. Within the inner cabin, the fire burned no higher than a man's knee, its glow steady, its warmth contained. Eamon measured time by sound, by the way the wind changed pitch against the walls, by the way the stove metal expanded and settled, by Rook's breathing. The German shepherd lay stretched across the center of the floor, his thick coat fluffed against the chill, but his body utterly relaxed. He did not pace, he did not whine. His ears flicked occasionally, but his eyes remained closed. To Eamon, that mattered more than any thermometer. On the second night, when the storm reached its fiercest, there came a pounding at the outer door. It was not the rhythmic knock of someone confident they would be answered. It was erratic, desperate, uneven, followed by a muffled cry that barely carried through the wind. Rook was on his feet instantly, body rigid, but he did not bark. He moved to the door and stood there waiting. Eamon pulled on his coat and unbarred the outer door with effort, snow cascading inward as it opened. A figure collapsed forward into the sheltered gap between the cabins, catching himself on the frame. It was Elias Reed. The thin man looked nothing like the one who had laughed weeks earlier. His blonde hair was plastered to his skull with ice, his face pale and blotched with red. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He was dragging a dog behind him by a length of rope, a medium-sized shepherd mix older than Jonah's dog, its fur gray-brown and matted with snow. One of its front paws was wrapped in torn cloth, already stiff with ice. I didn't know where else to go." Elias stammered words, tumbling out in panic. "My stove split. The fire went out. I tried to relight it, but his knees buckled." Eamon caught him before he hit the floor and hauled both man and dog inside the inner cabin. The door closed behind them, sealing the still air once more. The difference was immediate. Elias sagged against the wall, eyes wide, chest heaving, shock setting in as his body registered warmth too quickly. Rook approached the injured dog slowly, tail low, but relaxed, and lay down beside it, pressing his body close. The smaller dog whined weakly, then stilled, leaning into the heat without resistance. Elias stared at them, disbelief etched into every sharp angle of his face. How is it warm?" he whispered. "You barely have a fire." Eamon wrapped him in blankets, his movements calm, practiced. "Sit, breathe, don't move too fast." Outside, the storm screamed. Elias stayed through the night. By morning, his hands had regained color, and the dog's paw, though swollen and painful, was no longer frozen. When daylight filtered weakly through the cracks of the outer structure, Elias stood and looked around again, shame settling over his features. "I said you were mad," he said quietly. "I told people you were building your own grave." Eamon did not answer. Elias left with his dog when the wind briefly eased, gratitude replacing mockery, fear replacing certainty. He was not the last. By the third day, the storm had pushed the valley to its breaking point. Caleb Morn arrived next, his tall frame bent low against the wind, his limp pronounced. His beard was rimed white, his pale eyes bloodshot from smoke exposure. He did not bring a dog, but he brought news. 2 families down the valley had burned through their winter wood entirely. One man had passed out from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Ruth Kessler was sheltering a neighbor, but her place was failing. "I don't ask favors," Caleb said, voice hoarse, "but I don't want anyone else to die." Eamon listened. He nodded once. That night the storm peaked. Wind howled with such force that trees cracked and fell somewhere in the darkness, the sound like distant gunfire. Snow drove horizontally, filling every exposed space. The temperature dropped so low that breath crystallized instantly, hanging in the air like smoke. Inside the double cabin, the inner walls held. The fire-consumed wood slowly efficiently radiating heat that stayed where it belonged. The air between the two cabins acted as a barrier, cold but unmoving, absorbing the shock of the storm without passing it on. Snow packed so tightly against the outer walls that it became insulation rather than threat. Eamon stood near the inner wall listening. This was the test he had been building toward, whether he admitted it or not. Not the laughter, not the doubt. This. Rook lifted his head once when a particularly violent gust struck, then rested his chin back on his paws. He trusted the walls. He trusted the stillness. Near dawn, another figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, barely visible through blowing snow. This time it was a woman. She was shorter than Maribel, broader through the shoulders, her posture stiff with pain. Her dark hair was braided tightly down her back, already crusted with ice. Her skin was deeply tanned and weathered, her face lined with exhaustion. She clutched a small terrier mix to her chest, its wiry white fur soaked through one ear, torn long ago and never healed properly. Her name was Lena Crowley. She had been raised on the land, stubborn, proud, known for refusing help even when she needed it. Tonight, pride had lost. "My dog stopped shaking," she said weakly as Eamon pulled them inside. But I didn't. Inside the inner cabin, Lena sank to the floor, eyes closing as warmth enveloped her. She did not speak again for several minutes. When she did, her voice was steady but stripped bare. "I thought fire was enough," she said. "I thought if I kept feeding it, winter couldn't take me." Eamon looked at the stove, its low flames unwavering. "Fire fights cold," he said. "But it can't fight wind." By the time the storm finally broke, there were 7 living beings inside the inner cabin. Eamon Rook, Elias's dog, now returned home. Caleb resting briefly before leaving Lena and her terrier, and Ruth Kessler, who arrived before dawn with frostbitten fingers but clear eyes. They did not crowd the space as Eamon once feared. The warmth was even. The air was calm. Bodies found places to rest without clustering dangerously close to the fire. When morning came at last, it arrived quietly. The wind fell away, leaving a world reshaped. Snow lay chest-deep in places sculpted into drifts that made familiar landmarks unrecognizable. The valley looked wounded but alive. People emerged slowly from their cabins, hollow-eyed, moving like survivors of a siege. Smoke no longer rose everywhere. Some chimneys were dark. They looked toward Eamon's place. The outer cabin stood buried but intact. The inner door opened, releasing a wave of warm air into the cold morning. Rook stepped out first, stretching snow dusting his thick coat. He looked back once, then sat calm and steady as if guarding something sacred. The laughter was gone now. In its place was something quieter, heavier, understanding arriving too late for some, but not for all. After that winter, no one laughed at Eamon Calder anymore. The laughter did not end in an argument or a public apology. It simply thinned out and vanished like smoke when the fire dies down. The valley returned to its routines with a new caution stitched into them, a quiet awareness that survival had taken a different shape than they had believed. Eamon did not become a hero in the way stories like to crown men. There were no visitors with notebooks, no officials from the county, no photographs taken in front of his cabin. The attention he received came in pairs of boots crunching through snow, in hesitant knocks at his door, and in eyes that no longer mocked but asked. The first to return was Caleb Morn. The tall, raw-boned man arrived on a clear morning when the cold was sharp but no longer lethal. His limp still pronounced, his beard trimmed short, as if he had finally found the energy to tend to it. He stood in the clearing for a long moment before speaking, studying the double walls, half buried in snow, the way the outer shell bore the scars of winter while the inner door remained dry and solid. "I burned through half my barn to get through that storm," Caleb said, at last, his hoarse voice stripped of pride. Next winter I won't have that option. Eamon nodded and handed him a length of cord and a piece of charcoal. There was no ceremony. They walked the perimeter together, measuring, marking, talking little. Caleb listened more than he spoke, his pale eyes sharp, the stubbornness that once defined him redirected into attention. Word spread not through gossip now, but through demonstration. People noticed that Eamon's woodpile shrank at a fraction of the rate theirs did. They noticed how smoke from his chimney rose thin and pale even on the coldest nights, while others poured black and heavy into the sky. They noticed that when the temperature plunged after sundown, his door did not open and close with frantic urgency. The cabin held its breath and kept it. Eamon taught without lectures. He showed where bark must be stripped because it trapped moisture and invited ice. He showed how seams failed when chinking was rushed, how gaps too small to see could still pull warmth out of a body. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the weight of experience rather than opinion. Still air, he told them, tapping the space between the inner and outer walls. That's the work. Everything else is protection. Rook was always there, aging quietly beside him. The German shepherd's once black muzzle had turned pale gray, his stride slower, his ears less rigid, but his presence remained central. He lay in the middle of whatever space Eamon worked in, unmoved by conversation, watching hands and listening to sounds beyond human hearing. When someone built too close to a draft, Rook shifted position. When a gap was left unsealed, he rose and moved again. People noticed. They began to trust the dog as much as the man, not out of superstition but observation. Rook had never been wrong. That spring, a new family arrived from the south, drawn by the promise of land and the quiet rumors of a place that had survived a winter others had not. The woman's name was Mara Ellison. She was in her early 40s, tall and slender, with auburn hair worn loose down her back despite the cold and skin pale enough to flush pink at the first touch of frost. Her eyes were steady and direct, the eyes of someone who had already buried a great deal of disappointment and learned to move forward anyway. She traveled with her younger brother Thomas, a narrow-shouldered man with soft features and hands unused to heavy labor shaped more by books than tools. They had no dog, only a long-haired gray cat named Finch, thin and sharp-faced, perhaps 10 years old, whose yellow eyes missed nothing and whose tolerance for cold was limited at best. Mara did not ask if Eamon would help. She asked how. "I watched my husband freeze in a house that never stopped burning wood," she said quietly. Standing at the edge of the clearing, Finch tucked inside her coat. "I won't build another one like that." Eamon studied her for a moment, then nodded. He handed her the draw knife. The work was slow. It had to be. Eamon insisted on it not out of stubbornness, but necessity. Rushing introduced errors. Errors introduced wind. Wind introduced death. The double-wall cabins rose one by one across the valley, not identical but faithful to the principle. Some left 3 feet between walls, some 4. Some used thicker logs for the inner structure, others compensated with heavier chinking. Each was a negotiation between materials, labor, and patience. None were perfect. All were better than what came before. There were those who refused. Elias Reed did not rebuild. He left the valley in summer, selling what little he had and moving south, unable to look at the cabin that had nearly killed him without feeling something he did not want to name. Others stayed but adapted slowly, sealing gaps, adding windbreaks, doing what they could without fully committing. Eamon did not judge them. He had learned long ago that fear made its own decisions. By the time the next winter arrived, the valley looked different. Cabins sat heavier on the land, their outlines thicker, their roofs layered. Snow fell again, as it always did, and the wind returned relentless and indifferent. But when night came and the temperature dropped, fewer chimneys screamed with desperate smoke, fewer fires roared. Inside the double walls, families slept farther from their stoves, their bodies no longer locked in constant vigilance against cold. Rook spent most nights lying in the center of Eamon's inner cabin, his breathing shallow and even his joints stiff, but his spirit intact. Finch, Mara's cat, discovered the same spot weeks later, curling up beside him with surprising trust, her long gray fur catching the low light of the stove. She tolerated Rook's presence without affection, but she did not leave. Animals, Eamon observed, understood efficiency without explanation. Years passed without announcement. Eamon aged in place, his beard whitening fully, his shoulders rounding slightly, his hands stiff with old injuries. He did not slow his teaching, but he limited it, choosing carefully where to spend what strength remained. He never wrote instructions, he never drew plans. The knowledge passed through repetition, through watching, through mistakes corrected before they became fatal. It passed through the valley like a current too subtle to see, but strong enough to shape everything it touched. One winter evening, long after the memory of that first blizzard had softened into something bearable, Eamon stood between the walls of a cabin he was helping Mara finish. Snow fell gently outside, the kind that looked harmless until it stayed. Inside the inner structure, the air was already warming the stove, newly lit. Rook lay nearby, his muzzle resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Finch perched on a beam above, tail flicking lazily. "Do you ever wish you'd told them sooner?" Mara asked, her voice low. Before anyone got hurt, Eamon considered the question carefully. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Inside, nothing moved. "People hear when they're ready," he said finally. "Cold teaches faster than words." That night, the valley settled into sleep. Fires burned low and steady. Wind struck walls that did not answer it. Snow piled against structures built to accept its weight. And in the spaces between wood and wood, air remained still, doing its quiet work. There were winters after that, when storms returned with the same ferocity, when the mountains tested the valley again. But there were no more nights when someone froze 6 feet from a fire. No more desperate dismantling of furniture. No more smoke so thick it burned lungs from the inside. Eamon Calder did not leave behind a book or a name carved into stone. What he left was less visible and more enduring. A way of listening to what could not be seen. A refusal to accept the answers that had failed before. A knowledge passed hand to hand, wall to wall, winter to winter. And every time the snow fell and the wind howled through the forest, Rook lay down in the center of the floor, gray muzzle resting on old paws, and slept certain that this place would hold. Sometimes the miracle doesn't arrive as a sudden rescue or a blinding light from the sky. Sometimes it arrives quietly through patience, wisdom, and hands willing to listen to what the world is trying to teach. Eamon did not stop the winter. God did not remove the snow or silence the wind. Instead, he placed understanding in one man's heart, the understanding that stillness can protect, that care can outlast force, and that love expressed through action can save lives. In our daily lives, we often pray for storms to disappear. But more often than not, God answers by showing us how to stand through them. Maybe it's learning to slow down when the world tells you to rush. Maybe it's protecting your family, not with noise and anger, but with patience and wisdom. Maybe it's realizing that what seems small kindness, preparation, loyalty, can become the difference between despair and survival. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on the quiet miracles already present in your own life. Share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your words matter more than you know. And if you believe stories like this still have a place in the world, please subscribe to the channel and walk this journey with us. May God bless you and keep you warm in body, in heart, and in spirit. May He guide your steps through every winter you face, and may you always find shelter even when the storm feels endless. Thank you for being here. God bless you all.